What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Haunted Beard. My name is Jake. Well, I've been making my way through the Saw franchise, doing movie reviews for each of these, and today I'm here to talk about Saw 6, which in my opinion is a pretty significant step up above Saw 5. Here to give you my thoughts, let's get into it. So Saw 6 picks up immediately after Part 5. Agent Stram is now dead, and Agent Erickson draws nearer to Hoffman. Meanwhile, a pair of insurance executives find themselves in another game set by Jigsaw. And as I said, I think Saw 6 is a pretty significant step up from Saw 5. It came out in 2009, and it's interesting because I feel like for the first time, they're kind of working in a bit of commentary and almost kind of real life events into the storyline of the movie. Obviously, there was the big housing crisis and real estate stuff that happened in 2008. And they kind of worked a little bit of that into the movie, which I actually kind of appreciate. The opening scene here is pretty good as it involves two characters who, or like loan officers, who did these predatory lending deals to take advantage of poor innocent people. And so the movie is getting back on these sort of evil mortgage broker kind of thing. And the trap is set up to where, which one of them is going to give the most amount of flesh, right? And so you've got this overweight dude who's like cutting chunks out of his gut. And then you got the woman who, starts hacking off her arm. And it's just, it's just the good, crazy, insanity, bloody goodness that we've come to expect. So I like the opening scene pretty good. And like I said, I kind of like that it's kind of bringing in a little bit of sort of real life events, even a hint of commentary, as I'll talk about a little bit later with the health insurance stuff. But it's kind of bringing in a little bit of that aspect into the Saw movie. And I think it actually works pretty good. And then right after this, we pick up immediately after where Saw 5 leaves off. We see Hoffman getting out of the plexiglass coffin where Stram got crushed to death. And then shortly after, we're introduced to some new characters who are going to be featured predominantly in this. We're introduced to the health insurance agent, William, who he's getting ready to be the next player in the game. That happens. And then we're also introduced to like an investigative reporter named Pamela Jenkins, who she is wanting to track down Jill to get an interview with her. And like all the Saw movies, we're following a couple main storylines. Here we're following Hoffman as he continues to try to evade police while Agent Bluetooth and now Perez, who comes back from Part 4, are kind of hot on his tail a little bit as they're trying to figure out who he is. They haven't quite uncovered him yet. And then also we're now following the insurance agent William as he goes through his deadly game of tests and traps. Now, in terms of Hoffman's storyline, you pretty much get kind of the same stuff that we've gotten in the last few movies. I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of his character, although he has a couple scenes in this movie that I think work pretty good. But that half of the movie is just kind of more of the same and doesn't really do a whole lot for me. It's fine. But where I think Saw 6 kind of steps things up and is an improvement over Part 5 is in the game played by William, the health insurance guy. I quite enjoy this storyline of the movie, and it works quite well for me. Now, as I've mentioned in some of my other reviews, the Saw movies have to kind of come up with sort of a creative way to kind of bring their bread and butter, the character of Jigsaw, back into this, and a lot of it they have to just do through flashback, right? Because in the current timeline, Jigsaw is now dead. And they continue to do that in Saw 6. There is some flashbacks. There is some stuff that takes place on other timelines during some of the other Saw movies that I think is largely kind of unnecessary and, again, just sort of giving us information that we don't really need. But I do think there are a few flashbacks here that the scenes themselves, while they may not be the most necessary in terms of narrative, the scenes themselves I think are executed pretty well. And they're scenes that are flashbacks that are directly connected to Saw 6's characters and storyline. They're not filling in some backstory taking place during some of the other Saw movies. And those are the scenes that involve Jigsaw and William, as we get to see their initial meeting, and Jigsaw learns about him, and he learns about Jigsaw, and he finds out about how William uses the formula to decide who gets health insurance coverage and who doesn't, sort of who lives and who dies. And for the most part, I like the character of William, not because he's someone that you admire, but I think he's just at least kind of an interesting enough character. And when we first are introduced to him, he is denying this guy insurance coverage, which is essentially giving him a death sentence. And so right from the get-go, we kind of hate this guy. But it's that whole setup of him being a health insurance agent that I think makes his game that he goes through really compelling and really interesting. And then we get another flashback scene where John Jigsaw visits William at his office, and John's trying to see if he can get coverage for this kind of experimental treatment to help him get cured of the cancer. But of course, William turns him down and declines him. And I just really like this scene here. I think it's just a really solid scene with Jigsaw, who, again, is the best character. I think he just shines here, and just kind of his intensity of his performance is just really good. And I kind of like just the whole thing of, like, it's the Saw franchise kind of making a comment on the current healthcare system, right? And maybe it's not the most sophisticated comment, but at least it's saying something, and it makes for an interesting scene. And I think sort of bringing that aspect into a Saw film, it just kind of works and just kind of makes things interesting, right? Like it's just a formula of who lives and who dies, and that's how William operates.
Well, now I know they're not made by doctors and their patients or by the government. Made by the fucking insurance companies.
And I also like, too, that this is just kind of another sort of piece of the puzzle that turns John into Jigsaw, right? We get a handful of his backstory and see all the stuff that happens that sort of leads him into turning into Jigsaw. And this is just another one of those incidents where you can kind of understand how he turns into the killer that he does. And so this really leads us into the game that William has to play. And as I said, I really like this whole side of the movie. I really like this whole storyline, and I really like the traps and the setups for William's game. The opening one I think is really interesting, where he is in this contraption along with the custodian at his office, and every time they take a breath, this machine closes in on their rib cage until eventually, they get crushed. And just kind of a cool trap there. And I also like what they do by having him really be confronted with sort of the ethical issues of his work, right? Where they set up the trap to where he has to choose who lives and who dies. And he's got his secretary there and one of the young employees in his office. And it just kind of adds a little bit of an interesting element to this movie, right? It's almost like kind of a variation on the trolley problem, right? Where it's like, do you pull the lever or not pull the lever? Or who do you let live and who do you let die? And why would you make that decision, right? And so he's got his secretary there who is older and later on in life, but he has a personal connection with her. Or he's got the younger employee who's got his whole life ahead of him, but he doesn't really have that relationship with him. And it just kind of adds sort of an ethical complexity that just kind of makes the traps and the kills and the setups a little bit more interesting that I really enjoy. That's one of the aspects why this whole storyline I find just interesting and compelling, and it overall it works pretty good for me. And then I really like the final trap where he's got a handful of his employees on this little merry-go-round of death, and he has to, again, choose who lives and who dies. And this whole scene I just kind of find entertaining as they're all sitting there screaming and begging for their lives.
Wake up! You gotta get us out of here!
And he's got to make this decision, right? And then I like when it gets to the last guy who he's already saved the two people he can, so the last guy knows he's going to get it. And I kind of started laughing just because I thought it was entertaining when the guy just kind of goes off at him, right? And calls him every name in the book. I just get a kick out of it. And it's just a fun and gruesome and kind of brutal scene. But I enjoy it, and I think it's one of the better setups, and I think one of the better trap scenes in the Saw franchise. So I dig this scene quite a bit. Now, as far as Hoffman's storyline, we find out that he is really like in cahoots with Jill, and we finally get to figure out what is in that mystery box that Jigsaw leaves her in part 5, and it is these envelopes, as each envelope is sort of a different game. And Jigsaw's got this whole master plan that he wanted to continue out after his death. And so now Hoffman is really working with Jill to kind of carry out and finish Jigsaw's grand master plan. Now, I've said in previous Saw reviews, I am really not the biggest fan of the character of Hoffman. I don't find his character really all that compelling or interesting, especially as a follow-up to the complexity and kind of mysteriousness of Jigsaw. And I don't really think the performance is all that great. However, I will say Hoffman at least has a couple scenes in this movie that I think are pretty good. I still wouldn't say I'm a fan of his character, but there's at least a couple scenes here that work pretty well for me. Now, the first scene is he follows Agent Bluetooth, who unfortunately is sorely lacking his Bluetooth in this movie. That was a very big disappointment for me, but he follows Agent Bluetooth and Perez over to the audio technicians because they discover the tape. And this is actually the tape, I believe, that they pulled out of Jigsaw in part 4 during his autopsy. And they're running audio diagnostics on it to try to uncover whose voice it is and remove all the audio filters and everything. And eventually you find out that it's Hoffman's, right? His voice comes through the speakers, and there's just kind of that moment. And I just like this scene because I feel like we kind of really actually get to see Hoffman sort of in action a little bit, like his sort of killer like really comes out, and we actually get to see him like start killing people, whereas I feel like the vast majority of the time it's just him kind of trying to avoid detection sort of thing. And so he immediately turns around and slits Erickson's throat and then throws the hot coffee on Perez.
Right now, you're feeling helpless.
I just get a kick out of this scene. It's just fun, where it's just kind of like all of a sudden at the drop of a hat, it's like boom, and it's on. He gets found out. I just kind of like that quick little shift, and he just goes violent like that. And then Perez commits like the worst bystander shooting I've ever seen, where it's just like, why did she pull the trigger and she shoots the audio woman? Is just kind of a laughable part. But anyways, and then we get something that is just hilarious to me, and I can't help but bring it up because Hoffman he's trying to frame Stram, and so he leaves his fingerprints at the scene. And we get this, I think, hilarious flashback scene where Hoffman comes up out of the plexiglass coffin after Stram got crushed, and he looks up, and you just see Stram's hand like attached to the metal grating. And it's just a hilarious looking visual to me. And then he takes his little pliers and pries off his fingers. It's like, this might come in handy. I could use this, right? And then so he's going to use that to plant his fingerprints at the scene, which to me doesn't make any sense at this point, because it's like, if you already know the guy's dead, what good is planting his fingerprints at the scene gonna do? It's just a crazy sequence that I find pretty hilarious. Anyways, all that culminates into just a completely bonkers Saw twist ending that I quite enjoy. We find out that the couple people who are trapped along with William as he's playing his game, there's the mother and son who we assume to be his wife and son, only it's actually the wife and son of the guy who he basically issued the death sentence to in the beginning of the movie, and Pamela Jenkins is his sister. And so there's kind of that twist there, and the son ends up deciding to kill William, and we just get this gnarly scene where he gets injected with hydrofluoric acid, and he just like literally melts right in front of us. Pretty solid kill there that I quite enjoy. And then we find out that this Saw 6 brings Amanda back into the story just from some flashbacks. We find out that she was actually there when Jill lost her baby. And Hoffman actually knew this and was blackmailing her. And we find out that Jill ends up having an extra envelope that only she's seen, and she's going to take out her revenge on Hoffman, and she sets him up with one of those reverse fly trap type traps. And then we get to watch Hoffman kind of use his ingenuity and intelligence to get out of it partially. And then you get that final shot where it rips open and half of his jaw sort of hanging there. He's still alive, but he's missing half of his face. Just a great little gory visual to end the movie on. It is a completely ridiculously absurd series of twists and turns that I wouldn't have any other way. And so the ending of Saw 6 I find pretty satisfying, and I enjoy it quite a bit. So those are my thoughts on Saw 6. I, as I've said, think this is definitely a step up from Saw 5. I actually have a pretty good time with this one. I think for an overall grade, I'm probably going to go 6.5 out of 10 for Saw 6. So I have a pretty good time with this one. So those are my thoughts. Hit me up down in the comments. Let me know what you guys think of Saw 6. If you love it, if you hate it, would love to hear from you. Up next, obviously, we saw the final chapter. And if you like content like this, please hit that subscribe button, because this is what I do on The Haunted Beard. It is all horror and thriller movie content coming at you. And that's all I got for you. So I'll see you next time on The Haunted Beard.